They thought you were disposable, replaceable, as if everything you gave, your loyalty, your patience, your forgiveness, could be substituted like it meant nothing. So they walked away. Or worse, they pushed you aside. And in their arrogance, they believed the version of you they built in their mind could be replaced by someone easier, someone newer, someone more convenient. But what they didn't realize was that you weren't just a person in their life. You were the anchor. You were the one who stood through storms they pretended didn't exist. You were the peace in their chaos, the voice of reason when they couldn't even reason with themselves. Now, the person they thought would be more is starting to crumble. The mask is slipping. And while they won't say it out loud, you can feel it. They're not reaching for help because they miss love. They're reaching because they now understand what real love was. Your replacement is crying for help, the illusion of grass being greener. People often convince themselves that dissatisfaction is a sign that something better must exist, that if they feel bored, unfulfilled, or momentarily misunderstood, it must mean the source of that discomfort is external. Another person, another situation, another path. So they begin to wander, not always physically at first, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. They start detaching from what they once begged to have. The gratitude fades, replaced by silent resentment, and eventually they convince themselves that you were the problem. In their mind, they build a fantasy, a world where someone else will understand them better, laugh more easily, argue less, and fit more perfectly into the version of life they believe they deserve. That fantasy becomes intoxicating because it's easier to chase dreams than to confront the discomfort of growth. It's easier to imagine perfection than to commit to the work that real love, real trust, and real partnership require. And so they leap, not because they truly understand where they're going, but because they've become convinced that anywhere is better than here. They find someone new, someone who smiles easily, someone who doesn't yet know their flaws, someone who hasn't seen them fall apart at 2 a.m. and still stayed. In the beginning, that illusion feels real. It's shiny, it's novel, and most importantly, it hasn't been tested. But time has a way of peeling back layers, and reality doesn't delay its arrival forever. The very qualities they overlooked in you begin to surface as missing in this new person. Depth is replaced with surface-level conversation. Comfort is replaced with uncertainty. What once felt like an escape begins to feel like a prison built out of false expectations. They thought the grass would be greener, but it was artificial turf. It only looked good from afar because it hadn't weathered any storms. It hadn't been stepped on, fought for, or nurtured. It hadn't earned its beauty the way something real does. And now, as they sit in silence, next to someone who doesn't know them the way you did, who doesn't speak their unspoken fears or catch their hidden anxieties, the realization creeps in. Maybe they didn't upgrade. Maybe they just ran. And now they're trapped in a version of life that was supposed to be better, but feels painfully empty. Because it was never about finding someone better. It was about healing what was broken inside themselves. But instead of looking inward, they looked outward. And now they're paying the price for believing the lie that the problem was you. What they ran to has become a mirror, and it's showing them everything they refuse to face. Your absence is louder than your presence ever was. When you were there, they barely noticed the weight you carried for them. They got used to your patience, your consistency, your presence, not realizing that what felt effortless to them was often you pouring from a cup that was running dry. You showed up again and again, even when you weren't being seen clearly. You held space for their moods, their silence, their chaos, and they mistook that grace for weakness. They assumed you'd always be there because you always had been, and then one day you weren't. But silence has a strange way of amplifying truth. When you stopped answering immediately, when your name stopped appearing in their notifications, when your comfort was no longer within reach, that's when the void began to echo, not with noise, but with realization. They began to notice the absence of the little things. The way you checked in at just the right time, the way you noticed the change in their tone before they even knew they were unraveling, the way you believed in them when they couldn't even believe in themselves. See, presence is easy to overlook when it's constant, but absence reveals everything. Absence strips away denial. It makes the mind go quiet and the heart go loud. And the heart starts to ask the questions the ego tried to suppress. Why did they leave? Why does everything feel heavier without them here? Was I the one who made them feel unseen? And those questions don't come gently. They come like waves, subtle at first, then crashing with every reminder of what used to be. It's in the quiet moments, when no one is clapping, when the house feels too big, when the conversations feel too shallow, that they begin to feel it. You weren't just a companion, you were a grounding force. You were a mirror that showed them who they could be, not just who they were. You challenged them to grow, and they resented you for it, not realizing that the very discomfort they ran from was the soil for transformation. And now your absence is doing more than your presence ever could. It's teaching them, it's reminding them, it's confronting them. Because without you, they're not just missing a person, they're missing alignment, depth, safety. They replace you, but they didn't replace what you represented. And that truth haunts them more deeply than they'll ever admit out loud. They may never tell you this. Pride has a way of silencing apologies. But deep down, they know. They feel the shift. They feel the weight of what they lost. And no matter how much they try to fill the void with distractions, noise, or new faces, your absence keeps speaking. Superficial replacements cannot mirror depth. It's easy to find someone new. In a world built on convenience and appearances, replacement has become almost effortless. Swipe, scroll, choose, and just like that, someone else steps into the frame. But what they rarely realize at first is this: not every presence carries meaning, and not every connection is real. You can replace proximity, but you cannot replace depth. You can mimic the structure of a relationship, but not the soul of it. They may have found someone who looks good on paper, someone who's exciting, agreeable, maybe even less complicated. But what they forgot is that real connection is not built on surface compatibility. It's born through trials, through shared battles, through seeing each other at your worst and still choosing to stay. You gave them that, the kind of depth that doesn't ask for performance, but invites authenticity, the kind that makes room for vulnerability, silence, even contradiction. You didn't just listen to their words. You listened to the things they were too afraid to say. And that's what can't be duplicated. But the new connection they sought, it's still learning their highlight reel. It's still dancing on the surface, unaware of what lies beneath. At first, that feels safe. Less confrontation, less emotional demand. But over time, that safety becomes suffocating because surface level comfort cannot hold the weight of real life. When pain shows up, when shadows return, when identity begins to crumble, it's not chemistry that saves you, it's depth. And depth can't be built with someone who doesn't know how to swim where you once dove. They begin to feel it in the most unexpected moments. A conversation that feels rehearsed, a laugh that feels empty, a moment of emotional need met with blank eyes or cliché responses. And slowly it dawns on them, this new person might fit the image, but not the experience. They've replaced the heart with a hollow echo, hoping no one would notice the difference. But they notice, because the space you once held cannot be filled by imitation. You were complex, you were real, And most importantly, you were there, fully, even when it cost you. Superficial replacements are good at the beginning. They perform well. They say the right things. But performance is exhausting, and eventually the mask slips. And when it does, what they're left with isn't a partner. It's a stranger who can't reach the parts of them you once held with ease. That's when regret begins to bloom, not always loudly, but persistently. It shows up in the way they begin to withdraw, in the way their joy feels manufactured, in the way their eyes search for something that isn't there. Because here's the truth: you weren't perfect, but you were true. And truth doesn't fade. It lingers, it waits, it reminds, and it teaches. In the end, they don't cry for you because they miss being loved. They cry because they finally understand what love was, and what it will cost them to never experience it that way again. Consequence is the greatest teacher. People don't always understand the value of what they have in the moment. Some lessons are only fully understood in absence, in hindsight, when silence becomes the loudest truth. You gave them the opportunity to grow with you. You gave them patience, space, and time. But instead of embracing the rare gift of your presence, they took it for granted. They assumed there would always be more chances, more forgiveness, more time to get it right. But life doesn't keep giving out unearned grace. Eventually it answers what we refuse to learn with something far more powerful than warnings: consequences. And unlike your gentle reminders, life doesn't whisper, it exposes, it corrects, it brings clarity through contrast. What they once dismissed becomes the very thing they now crave. What they once called too much now feels like the exact amount they needed. But now it's gone, and that void doesn't just sting, it educates. Regret becomes the silent companion they never asked for. It doesn't scream or shout, it lingers. It shows up in moments they don't expect, in the way a song hits differently now, in the way certain words echo with your voice, in the way they reach for comfort and are met with confusion instead. Every new interaction is filtered through the memory of you. And while they may pretend they've moved on, their soul knows better. They're not seeking love anymore. They're seeking relief from the weight of what they lost. You were willing to walk with them through their darkness, but they wanted light without effort. Now, they sit in a different kind of darkness, not caused by pain, but by the realization that they chose something temporary over something real. And that's what life is now showing them. You don't get to trade away authenticity without a cost. You don't discard depth without being haunted by its absence. You don't walk away from someone who truly cared without eventually being met by your own reflection, empty-handed and full of questions. And this consequence? It doesn't seek revenge. It seeks awareness. It forces them to confront the truth they tried to avoid. That love isn't about who makes you feel good for a moment. It's about who builds with you through seasons. You were that builder. You laid foundations while they played in fantasies. Now the structure is crumbling and there's no blueprint left to follow. They may never admit it. They may cover it up with smiles, distractions, even denial. But consequence doesn't need recognition to do its work. It operates silently, internally, relentlessly. And in the quiet of the night, when no one's watching, when the room is still, it whispers the truth. You lost something you will not find again, and that truth becomes their teacher, the one they can't ignore, the one they can't escape. You are not meant to be easily replaced. Some people never truly understand the gravity of who you are until you're no longer within reach, and even then it takes time. Because when they first walk away or push you away, they're still lost in the illusion that people like you are easy to find, that the traits you carried, your patience, your loyalty, your emotional presence are standard. They tell themselves, I'll find someone else, as if your presence was a product on a shelf ready to be exchanged. But time doesn't lie, and time reveals what people try to deny. You were never meant to be easily replaced, because what you brought to the table wasn't noise. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't flash. It was substance. You were the quiet stability they didn't know they needed until it was gone. You didn't try to impress them with grand gestures or dramatics. Instead, you did the work. You listened deeply. You stood by them when their world fell apart. You didn't just love them, you saw them. You carried their insecurities with compassion, and you gave them a space where they didn't have to perform to be accepted. But they weren't ready for that kind of love. They confuse emotional safety with emotional boredom. They mistook peace for dullness. Because when someone hasn't healed, when someone doesn't know how to sit in stillness, they begin to crave chaos. Not because it's good for them, but because it's familiar. They thought they wanted more. What they really wanted was louder. And louder doesn't mean better. Louder just drowns out the parts of themselves they weren't ready to face. So they reached for something that felt different, and for a while they convinced themselves it was better. But over time, what they thought was better starts to show its limitations. The depth isn't there. The consistency isn't there. The truth, it never was. Because it was never about the new person being more valuable. It was about the old connection being too real. Real enough to challenge them. Real enough to confront them. Real enough to expose what they needed to work on. And that's what you represented, not just comfort, but growth. And you didn't just hold space for them, you held up a mirror. You reflected back both their beauty and their brokenness. And that kind of presence, that kind of emotional power, it's not only rare, it's irreplaceable. It's sacred. It's the kind of love that doesn't just touch your heart, it reforms your character. But here's the truth. People rarely see the gift while they're unwrapping it. They only see it when it's no longer theirs to hold. Now they sit with the reality that someone else occupies the space you once filled. But it's not the same, not even close. They replaced the title, not the experience. They filled the role, not the soul. And in moments of quiet honesty, they feel it deeply. When conversations with their new person feel forced, when laughter doesn't reach their eyes, when they break down and realize there's no one who understands the language of their silence the way you did. The connection may be functional, but it isn't transformational. You see, being irreplaceable doesn't mean people won't try. They will. They'll search for you in eyes that aren't yours, in voices that don't carry your tone, in gestures that don't come from the same place of sincerity. But it will never land the same, because what they're really missing is themselves when they were with you. You gave them access to a better version of who they could be, and now, without you, they're just trying to remember how that version ever existed. Your presence pulled more out of them. It inspired growth. It demanded honesty. It asked them to rise, not just to love you well, but to love themselves enough to evolve. And now that you're gone, they're left with a version of themselves that feels smaller, more confused, less capable of connection. You didn't just leave a space in their life. You took the light that was showing them who they were capable of becoming. And the person they chose instead, they're not the villain. They're not the one to blame. They're just not you. They're not built to carry what you carried. They weren't forged in the same fire. They weren't designed to handle the same depth, to give the same grace, or to walk through the same storms. And the weight of that is slowly collapsing on them. That's why the cries for help have started. not because they suddenly value connection, but because they're finally waking up to what real connection was. You didn't lose them. They lost you. And not just you as a person, but everything that came with your presence. The peace, the accountability, the protection, the healing, the emotional clarity. And now they're crying out, maybe not with words, maybe not publicly, but deeply, because they know they won't find it again. Not in the way you gave it, not with the heart you gave it from. But here's the part you must understand. This story was never about them realizing your worth. It was about you realizing that your worth was never supposed to be proven through pain. You were not meant to teach people through your suffering. You were meant to walk away not in bitterness, but in wisdom. Let them learn. Let them sit in the silence they created. Let them face the weight of what they lost, because their lesson isn't your burden to carry anymore.